Our next knowledge area is the project procurement management. This is where we'll discuss those contracts that we have to bring people in or contract with vendors so that we can be successful in our project. This has become increasingly a difficult and interesting type of knowledge that we all need because there are more and more contracts coming on board. Vendors are being brought in from multiple places. They're being brought in using overseas resources as well. And it's something we need to be aware of. A lot of project managers do not come from a business school background. This is one of those areas that can sound confusing, but I want to simplify it for you and let you understand this knowledge area and the processes associated with it. Now we have three processes. We have plan procurement management, conduct procurement, and control procurement. You'll note on the slide that the close procurement has been X'd out. That's because in this version, we have moved this activity and these processes into the close project, close phase area. The reason for this is that when we close the project, it's natural that we would close all the contracts as well if we are doing a procurement effort and have procurement as part of it. It was always a redundancy to say that we have to close procurement somehow separately than closing the project. So we have taken it out of this area, and I wanted to show it to you so there's no confusion of why it was taken out when you look at earlier versions of this material. Now, planning procurement management. Our inputs are our project management plan, our requirements documentation, our risk register, our activities resource requirements, our project schedule, our activity cost estimates, our stakeholder register, our enterprise environmental factors, and our organizational process assets. We use make or buy analysis, which is just what it sounds like. Do we want to make something or do we want to buy it? Do we want to procure it or can we make it ourselves? That's the kind of bouncing back and forth we do. In the software world, it makes perfect sense because we have technical resources that may be able to actually develop a product for us. We may not. We may have partial resources or resources that could do part of the solution, but we need to bring in expertise from outside. I know as a project manager who's been a contractor, I've been one of the resources that have been brought in to affect different projects across a gamut of IT areas. We need expert judgment. Market research. You don't want to buy something, even a contract with a vendor, without having an understanding of what the market is. And we use meetings. Our outputs include our procurement management plan. Your procurement management plan will be present when you know you have to go out and get a vendor. Or it could be that it's part of this master project management plan, but in it you're going to make a decision based on the make or buy analysis. So it could be that we're going to determine whether we need to go and procure. But that should be noted within a procurement management plan in the master project management plan. Other outputs, the procurement statements of work, procurement documents, source selection criteria. How are we going to select? When we build a plan, we need to know what are the criteria for certain decisions to be made. The make or buy decisions can be an output of this plan. And change requests. Again, if our original concept is deviated from, we do change requests. And project documents get updated. Characteristics of a contract, because we're talking about a contract, it's a formal and binding agreement. The terms are supported by our legal system. This is a legal document. This may sound different for some of you, but realize we want to be very specific so that we understand the baseline characteristics of the contract and what you will be possibly administrating as a person running a project that has this procurement as part of it. Changes are controlled in writing and with formal sign-off and acceptance. So you simply can't send an email and say change something. It needs to be formal. It needs to be in writing. Requirements are included in the contract, and those not included are considered out of scope. So there may be things including payment terms, intellectual property, copyrights, and responsibilities. Things that are in scope should be in the contract. Those that are not in scope will be out of the contract. And you need to understand kind of the difference. Every single contract has different types of governing regulatory things, or possibly could. A contract itself is very simple. It's a very simple document. But a lot of the stipulations around it can get ponderous. That's why we don't like to look at our contracts. We see contracts every day. We sign off on them generally without reading every single word, much less understanding it. When you're dealing with a project, you will have support in this effort. Generally, there are procurement units within an organization that help do this, as well as a legal firm, or legal crew that will look over the contracts and make sure that they're written both properly, legally, and within the stipulations that the organization wants to agree to. The goal is to meet all your contractual requirements and conditions. You don't want to write a contract that you want to break. The whole idea of a contract is it's something that is mutually beneficial. I pay you something, you give me something back. And that should be mutually beneficial, and we agree to it in writing. Now, here is a make or buy analysis. This is also called a buy or build or buy analysis. But the factors include for building or making, you want to know that if I build something, I may want to keep the intellectual property rights. In working with the phone company years ago, it was a very big deal that we kept the intellectual property rights, patents, etc. for all products. And it was viewed as being a strategic goal. We didn't want to buy anything. We wanted to build it or have it contracted to build. But we would eventually own it and own the intellectual property rights. Now, the buyer has the capability and the capacity to build. So when you're looking at whether you're going to build or not, can you? Are you capable? Do you have the capacity? Is there enough of your resources available? For buying it, you look at, does the buyer have the capacity? If the buyer doesn't have the capacity, you might want to buy it and not just build it. You might want to look at somebody and buy it. And if you don't have the capacity and the capability, I may have reversed that, but they're both right together. The capacity and the capability need to be there. If they're not there, then it's easy to see that I should buy something and not build it or make it. Many companies are performing market research, and they do this as a preparatory action before going into a big procurement. The effort includes things like analyzing industry information, looking at the vendors, the public information, websites, things that are readily available, seeing if the technologies are compatible to what is currently available at the company. Also, they research at conference online reviews. Every mode of research is done that you can think of. We have a vast source out there on the internet. RFIs are sometimes circulated. What an RFI is, a request for information. What the RFI allows you to do is to give a general idea of what you're trying to buy. And then you can ask different vendors to give you how would they approach it, and sometimes you'll get a guesstimate of amount of money. Now, this is not held to. I mean, it's not a legally binding agreement that you enter into with the different vendors, but it gives you a market research point of view of what is out there that you could possibly buy and the prices around the solutions to your problem. Now, in conducting your procurement management, our inputs are our procurement management plan, our procurement documents, our source selection criteria, seller proposals, project documents, our make or buy solution decisions, our procurement statement of work, our organizational process assets, and we use things like bidder conferences, proposal evaluation techniques, independent estimates, expert judgment, advertising, analytic techniques, procurement negotiations, and we have an output into our procurement management plan. So as we start conducting procurement, we are updating the procurement management plan. We're looking at the procurement statement of work. What is the work that we expect to buy? Procurement documents, selection criteria for the source, make or buy decisions, change requests, project document updates, and now we look at the required contract elements. We're going to enter into a contract. You may not be in charge of this, but you need to understand the basics, and here they are. The capacity. You have legal entities. So whoever is signing this is working as the legal entity and has the capacity. Consideration. An item to change possession, something for something else. Offer. Proposition of exchange. So if I buy this software for you, I will give you $1 million. Purpose. The reason must be legal. You cannot legally enter into an illegal contract. So it makes logical sense, but you realize the law can be very complicated. So it's important that the contract, you understand that a contract's purpose must be legal. Acceptance. The buyer accepts the offer. The seller gives the offer, the buyer accepts it. Bidder conferences are used sometimes when you have a large number of vendors and you want them all to hear the same thing. The RFP process is your request for proposal. That's more of a legally binding proposal that goes out, and when you accept it from the vendors, then you can enter into the contract. What you want to do is to make sure that all the vendors that are potentially out there are hearing exactly the same thing, so they don't bounce back at you and say, we were not given a fair shake. This is especially true with large companies with deep pockets and governmental entities. They will have bidder conferences so that anyone who's interested in the work that they are offering out has a chance to hear exactly the same thing. So there's no confusion, and no one will come back and be litigious back at them. Proposal evaluation techniques. When you're going for a request for proposal, there are different techniques that include things like gathering a group of reviewers of the bids. You might have a group of SMEs, of subject matter experts, of people from different parts of the project, stakeholders generally, and possibly some other people from outside the actual project that are more in the procurement area or legal area to look at the bids. You might use a selection criteria that you formalize. It's best if it's predefined before the bids are in. So you're not trying to warp your selection criteria to the bids that you have. You want it to be solidified, and when the bids come in, you bounce those bids off of that criteria. The reviewers need to have read the bids, and either all the bids or have them split up. That both policies work. There's no real governing way to do it. If you have too many bids, it becomes absolutely impossible for a group of reviewers who are doing other things to read everything. So you might split them up, and everybody would go through several bids and read them and review them and then report back to the larger group. Decisions are made by the group, and the criteria is the guiding and supports the award of the contract. So the decisions generally are made by a group, not an individual, though it may need individual approval or signature because of legal ways that contracts need to be entered into between organizations. But in terms of the pure selection, the selection is generally done by a group of experts that are duly assigned. The criteria can include a lot of different factors, including price, supporting price, meaning the price to support the product once it's installed. It can have compliance with requirement scores, so you've given them exactly what you want it to do, so then you bounce that off of how they say they're going to do it. Fiscal solvency, you may need to check to see if this company will be in business in a year, in 5 years. How are they doing? And that's fair game completely. Maturity of the technology, you don't want to buy obsolete product. The vendor's years in business. I mean, there are tons of different points of criteria that you can use. A lot of it will be dependent on your industry and your organization and how they generally do their procurements. Independent estimates is when you get an independent source not associated with the project, and it is a way of getting independent cost analysis. That's really what you're trying to do. You don't want to spend too much. You want to know what it costs to procure something that you have defined. Advertising is a technique that expands the selling group, the sellers. You might advertise, I'd like something, and what you're trying to do, you put it in major publications, and some governments like to do this because it helps announce the pending contract. It brings both publicity and possibly new sellers into the world, or new sellers into the realm of this potential buyer. Analytic techniques include, they're used in the procurement to determine the readiness of a vendor to provide whatever you are trying to procure, the products, the services, and they look at, what you're looking at is the past performance information. You want to look to see if there's any potential risks that need to be monitored closely once the vendor is selected. Negotiations of procurement. This refers to the process of clarifying the structure, requirements, terms of agreement prior to it being signed. So there's a negotiation that happens. We've talked about negotiating techniques in general, and these kinds of techniques are used heavily in the procurement area. You want a final agreement that results in a contract that's executed by both parties. Both parties have an obligation to that contract. It may be that, as I've said before, project managers are not always privy in complex contracts. It's important that you understand the basics of the contract and are privy to the statements of work and can communicate with the proper parties, both vendor side as well as your organizational side, so that there is a good handoff, and that the project where this procurement is being used, you're bringing in something, whether it's whole thing or whether it's part of a greater project. You need to be a part of it and be helpful in the clarity of some items. Now, the type of contracts we have are firm fixed price. That's a standard project where you say, bring me this and I'll pay you an exact amount once it's in. It works well if the scope of the product or service to be delivered is well defined. That way, the price can be well defined and no one is hurt because everyone gets what they want. The vendor gets their money, the company gets their product. A fixed price incentive fee works similarly to the firm fixed price, except there may be some incentives put in for performance, for timing of the delivery of the product or service, so that the vendor may be incentivized to do things quicker or better, and that's built into the contract. So they'll get one price and maybe more if they do a really good job. That's basically what they're talking about. We have fixed price with economic price adjustments. When you have a long-term contract, there may be a connection to the economy that is built into the project. So you have a fixed price, you agree upon it, but it may escalate according to inflation or some other economic factor that is built into the contract. So it helps to adjust a contract that has a long life, meaning multiple years to see fulfilled. You have a cost plus a fixed fee. So what that's talking about is that the vendor will give you records of exactly what they had to spend on this product or service to deliver it. And you are saying, okay, we'll pay you exactly what it cost you. We're not going to question that. And we'll give you a fixed fee. Could be a percentage, could be a flat fee for the delivery of that. So there's more risk on the buyer side in that scenario. Cost plus incentive fee. The fixed fee is based on whatever is agreed to. When it's an incentive fee, that means that there must be certain conditions met by the seller to the buyer's agreement. And those are usually set forth in the contract, and it can be on performance, it can be on how well they meet the user acceptance of the product. There's a lot of different moving parts potentially in that. But it's conceptually the same. Whatever it cost you to build it, plus whatever we've agreed to give you on top of that as an incentive, because we want it done well or we want it done fast or something like that. But the incentive fee may be a scaled fee, not simply a flat fee on top of it. You have time and materials. Most of my contracts that I've worked under are time and materials, meaning I'm worth X number of dollars, and I'm worth X number of dollars per hour. And if I work 10 hours, then I get 10 times that amount. So if I'm a $100 an hour consultant and I work 40 hours a week, do the math. That's the fee that's owed me. So that's the kind of fixed time and materials rather that we look at with a lot of software development, IT, infrastructure. It's also used in other industries, but it's just a flat way of looking at the contract structure and often used. Purchase orders are for items that have a standard price to them, pretty much. They're maybe commodity items, and you just get it through a purchase order. There may be an agreed upon amounts for things. Think about office supplies, building supplies, things like that are typically done that way. Sometimes equipment can be done with purchase order as well. It's just a contractual setup that is not executed one time, but is agreed upon for a specific period of time, that I can buy goods and services basically by sending you an order for them, you send them back, I send you a check. It's kind of straightforward. Now, total point of consumption is an idea we'll talk about here. It's the point in which the supplier bears all costs. In certain contracts, there's set up a situation where you're going to, at a certain point, I'll pay you until it gets to a point. At that point, you're going to be paying everything. So if you haven't delivered on time, there's a point where you're going to assume all responsibility for how much it costs to deliver the final product. And that's what it's talking about here. It's determining this total point of assumption. And this is an important thing for certification. This is one of those formulas that we do look at. Basically, the total point of assumption is the ceiling price minus the target price divided by the buyer's share plus the target cost. Sounds complicated. It's not. Just keep it one piece of data at a time. Procurement documents can include, and we've mentioned these a little already, we have requests for a quote, which is not different from some other things. Request for proposal is what we've talked about before. Request for quote is similar, used in different industries generally. Request for information is that less binding document that is sometimes sent out to gather marketing information, other information about who does this type of service and builds this kind of item for you. The request for proposal we've talked about before, similar to the request for quote. We have an invitation for bid that's also used. Governments use this, and it's a matter of they ask you to bid something. This might be closed or open. It really is just another procurement document type. Qualified servers list is when you are pre-screen the sellers. In a lot of industries, people don't buy from just anybody. They want to, before they even decide to buy anything, they want the sellers to be pre-screened. They want to know who they're talking to. They don't want to waste time. That's what a qualified sellers list is. Governments use these a lot. Big companies use these a lot. And a lot of the purchase order or time and materials type of contracts are used this. It reduces the paperwork once it's in, so that the seller and the buyer are not going through a complete screening process every time they are trying to purchase a computer, or they're trying to buy a stack of 2x4s, or they're trying to bring in a project manager or a business analyst. Now, single source and sole source. These are definitions that you need to be aware of. The buyer has decided not to use any other provider of the service in a single source. So there's only one provider. I have one provider for a particular service. Sole source. There is no other source for a specific product or service. If I want to buy an Apple product, I can get it through, probably some resellers, maybe, but I can't buy it from a whole other company. It's pretty much a sole source device. Single source means you've decided not to go to other people. You might have an agreement with Dell to provide all the computers, or Apple. Doesn't matter, but you've decided not to use any other provider. Sole source is different. Note, they can sound similar, they have different meanings. Now, controlling procurement management. Our inputs here are project management plan, the procurement documents, our agreements, our approval change requests, approved change requests, our work performance reports, our work performance data. Our tools include our contract change control system, our procurement performance reviews, our inspections and audits, our performance reporting, our payment systems, as we are paying money, our claims administration, and our records management systems. We have outputs of the work performance information, our change requests, our project management plan updates, our project document updates, and our organizational process asset updates. Now, a contract change control system. This is a system in which the contract can be modified. It may be a formal system, it may be informal, but it tracks the procedure and the system, dispute resolution procedures, and the parties and positions that are authorized to make any changes. So the idea here is we have a change control system in place, and we need to go by and use that. A procurement performance review, now, that's a structure by which the progress of a vendor's making to meet the contract goals. And the goals are by the triple constraint plus quality, cost, scope, schedule. And the objective is to identify successes and failures early. It's to make sure that everything is within the contract goals, and you review it to make sure that the vendor is not found in contract non-compliance. Now, what we're talking here is making sure that this review happens on a timely basis. And it works mainly with large, drawn-out, expensive contracts, because we don't want to know that the contractor is going to fail, the vendor is going to fail to supply it way late in the process. We want to know early, and we want to have contract stipulations in there so that we can see what's going on to make sure that they're on their budget, on their schedule, scope is good, quality is good. This is where earned value management is used with large companies and governmental entities to try and have good information about these parameters. Checks and balances, inspections and audits, and performance reports. Now, inspections and audits these are the contracted terms where the buyer has required the seller to support these efforts. The inspections and audits, they are executed for the project, and they are verify the compliance of the seller with the contract. So when you hear people talk about audits and inspections, these are not something that the buyer surprises the seller with. These are contracted points in time, things that are part of the contract themselves. They're the details that are in there. They're checks and balances. Performance reports are delivered by the seller and are compared with the terms of the contract. If you are trying to get a large number of units out of a seller, you want to know that you're getting them. And the performance report is delivered by the seller, typically, because the buyer can only say what I've received if it is product coming in or the services. And they compared with each other. Claims administration refers to the process of handling contested changes where the buyer and seller are not in agreement as to the compensation or the quality of the change or the type of change that has occurred. This involves alternative dispute resolution. We've talked some about conflict resolution. Think about conflict resolution on a bigger scale. This is resolution through mutual negotiation, which is preferred, or it can have arbitration or other types of alternate dispute resolution avenues. Generally, this is spelled out in the contract language that if we have a dispute, here's how we will handle it. Record management systems are a generic term for the systems in which a project manager manages the contract and procurement documentation and records. In large companies, the project manager may or may not touch that system often. They may have access to it read-only sometimes. But the idea here is all that contract materials needs to be handled. If you are an employee of a large company, you might have that access. Contractors are sometimes limited. Depends on the level of employment. A lot of times whether the project manager enters that system on a regular basis and the ability to affect anything except maybe read or see what's in there. But it is something that is controlled and is a generic term. It's important to understand the generic term because it's called different things in different places. And when we talk about it from a general, when we're looking at asking questions about it, we need to have a generic way of asking the question rather than try to figure out what are the specifics for the companies. Other procurement terms. We have legal terms. Privity, the relation between two parties that is recognized by law. Letter of intent. We have incentive, claims. All of these we've talked about to a degree. Letter of intent is just that. It tells you that you intend to do something. It has limited legal binding, but it depends on the language in it, the state you're in. There's a lot of different possibilities, but it is generally a statement of goodwill between two parties. The incentive we talked about in contract terms, it's how you get people to do something for you. That's usually outside some of the, it's a part of the contract language. Claims, we've talked about any claims that either party may have against the other. The alternative dispute resolution, we talked about that. Termination clause, a lot of contracts have a termination clause, which means if one party does not fulfill a certain obligation at a certain time frame, then the clause states that the whole contract can be either terminated or it can be thrown into a different situation. But a termination clause generally is fairly cut and dry. So, these are our processes for procurement management. We plan procurement, conduct procurement, and control procurement. Our key information review. Key terms. Contract. Understand what it is, the different types of them, including a firm fixed price, which is a very common one in most industries. We have RFP, the request for proposal. PTA, which is the point of total assumption, something key to certain contracts that are long and really is looking at the seller having to assume the total remaining cost of delivering a product or service. We have buyer, we have seller, we have cost reimbursement, we have selection criteria, and we have incentives. And those are the key terms for our procurement knowledge area.